Good afternoon, everybody. I am Miss Marcy Hines, and I'm going to be walking you guys for the next 6 weeks through the rest of our U.S. History 10 curriculum. Well, what I want to start off with today, guys, is kind of walk you through what can you expect over the next 6 weeks from me. Many of you know that when we left, we were kind of at the point where we were looking at reform movements. We were looking at change, of course, in U.S. history about the mid-1800s. We're looking at the abolitionist movement. We're looking at the temperance movement. A lot of change is happening at this point. But, of course, we've got a lot of issues going on with slavery at this point in U.S. history. So before we can actually get into our first objective, what we're going to cover today, we're going to start looking at the causes of the Civil War. But before we get too deep into that, let's look at what we can expect for the next couple of weeks. So we're going to cover 3 objectives over the next couple of weeks. And the first objective that we're going to cover as we move into next week will be the Civil War. So essentially, we'll go through all the objectives as we go through this, talk about them a little bit more in depth. But for now, just understand, we're going to go through the Civil War period. We're going to move into Reconstruction. That's the period following the Civil War. And then finally, we're going to end with industrialization. So we will finish up the course where we should be by the time that we get through our 3 objectives. Now, what we're going to move into today, though, before we can get to the Civil War, one of the things that we've got to do, we've got to talk about how do we get to the Civil War? What were the big causes of the war at this point? So what we're going to start off today, guys, the prelude to the Civil War, we're going to look at the time period from about 1844 to 1860. And what are the major issues that led to the Civil War in 1861? It's going to take us a few minutes to get there, but that's going to be our main focus today so that next week we can pick up with the opening of the war and start talking about the Civil War a lot more in depth. So what are some of the major issues that's plaguing the United States at this point in the middle of the 19th century, 1800s? One of the biggest problems, not really a problem, but it's going to cause some problems, is going to be the acquisition of new territories in the United States. And this starts pretty early in American history. By 1803, we've added the Louisiana Purchase. That was purchased during Thomas Jefferson's administration from France. That's going to nearly double the size of the United States at that point. More land, more territory, more power. Next, by 1845, we have the annexation of Texas. That's even more territory added to the United States. Of course, after Texas gains their independence, that's going to lead us into the Mexican-American War, though. We're also going to gain the Oregon Territory from Great Britain. We're going to sign a treaty with Great Britain in 1846 to gain that territory. And then finally, by the time that we get to 1848, we've gained a massive amount of territory as a result of the Mexican-American War. So that's the big thing that we're going to look at is how is the acquisition of all these territories going to cause problems politically here in the United States. And the biggest thing that we're going to look at, of course, with this is going to be the expansion of slavery. So again, looking here back at the PowerPoint, we'll see what are the pros of this acquisition of this territory, this massive amount of territory. We're going to look at a map here in just a second. One of the big pros, it fulfills the idea of manifest destiny. I'm not sure if you guys had the opportunity to talk about manifest destiny, of course, before we got out, but manifest destiny was an idea that started to bubble up in the middle of the 19th century that dealt with the idea that, of course, the United States was going to expand from the East Coast all the way to the West Coast, that we were supposed to take up, be a transcontinental, of course, nation from one side to, of course, the other. That's a positive. It adds more territory, and of course, it's going to add more land mass for the expansion of our population, which we'll talk about more in just a moment. But a big con of the acquisition of a lot of this territory, of course, is going to be the increase of the slavery debate. If territory is added to the United States, does that new territory become slave territory? All right, so if we take a look at our map here, guys, remember, when we look at maps and we talk about map skills, what is the first thing that we should do anytime that we look at a map? We need to look at the title of the map. Look at the title of the map and also the map key. Not a massive map key here, but we do know, of course, the name of this map is U.S. Territorial Acquisitions. You got a lot going on in this map, but what I want to show you real quick before we move deeper into this content is just how much land the United States is going to gain from 1803 all the way to 1848, right before, of course, the decade we get into the Civil War. So as you can see, of course, on the map, we have a massive amount of territory gained by the Louisiana Territory, the annexation of Texas, the Oregon Territory, and then, of course, the acquisition of the territory that was gained as a result of the Mexican-American War. And pretty much what that does is fulfill the rest of the United States. What we think of as the continental United States is going to exist by 1848, 1850, okay? So a lot of land, a lot of territory. But again, as people move into this territory, is this territory going to be free territory or is it going to be slave territory? All right, so before we dig a little bit deeper into this, one of the big things that we've got to talk about is the differences, of course, in the regions, the different regions of the United States, okay? One of the terms that we use, of course, in class is sectional differences. We have differences based on what section of the country that you live in. And a lot of that deals with, of course, economic differences. This is something that, of course, hopefully in your 10th grade classes you've been talking about since the beginning of the creation of the colonies. We've always had manufacturing, shipping in the north. We've always had, of course, agriculture in the south. And again, that right there is going to lead to big divisions between the north and the south based on, of course, their economic statuses. So by the time that we get to the mid-1800s, we're to the point where the north is mainly industry-based, okay? Industry starts to come into the north. We talk about factories. You talked about the Lowell mills a little bit earlier on, the textile mills that start to boom in the early 1800s. By the time that we get to the mid-1800s, by the 1850s, the north is highly industrialized. And when we get to the Civil War, you're going to see the advantage that is for the north. Now, when we talk about the south, by this time in U.S. history, guys, cotton is king, okay? That's a term that we use a lot in U.S. history during this time period to describe what was the main economic activity in the South. It was cotton. Earlier on, prior to the advent of the cotton gin by Eli Whitney in the late 1790s, of course, cotton wasn't that massive of a crop. It was very hard to grow. It was very hard to process. But once we have the advent of the cotton gin, we're going to see, of course, this boom in cotton economically in the South. And what that's going to do is, of course, increase slavery in the South. So we're starting to see a very sharp divide here by the time that we get to the mid-1800s of what the economic activities in the South are and what they are in the North. Now, what about the West? I showed you on the map a few minutes ago, we've gained a lot of territory as a result of different land acquisitions, everything from the Louisiana Purchase all the way, of course, to the land acquisitions from the Mexican-American War. And in the West, agriculture is the main economic activity. Now, one thing to understand about the West, why is the West going to grow so quickly? We got all the land, but there's another big reason we're going to see an influx of people moving into Western territories. It's simply because the eastern seaboard of the United States was highly populated at this point. By the time that we get to the late 1830s, early 1840s, we have a lot of people immigrating into the United States seeking refuge for different reasons. The main, of course, being economic purposes. If you remember, let's see if you guys can think about this. What was the main issue going on in Ireland in the mid-1840s? Of course, we know the potato famine was happening at that point, and that was destroying crops left and right in Ireland. And that was driving a lot of people, of course, to leave Ireland and come to the United States because they needed, of course, a better economic situation for themselves and to be able to feed themselves. Because, of course, millions of people die in Ireland during this time period because of the potato famine. But, of course, there's people coming from all over Europe during this time period and settle in the United States as we become more industrialized. But you've got a lot of people coming from Europe that are looking for opportunities to farm. We know at this point in Europe, is there really any land to be had for people in Europe to actually grow crops and have massive farms? No, a lot of that land, of course, that's already taken up. It's not available for people to farm. So a lot of farmers are going to come to the United States with the hopes of moving westward to start new lives for themselves. But as people move westward and agriculture moves westward, there's always going to be this big question, is slavery going to move westward as well? People like Stephen Douglas, who we'll talk about in a few moments, didn't think that slavery would move to the west because in the prairie region, in the Midwest region, where, of course, a lot of our crops are still grown to this day when it comes to foodstuffs, that, of course, you don't need a whole lot of labor in those fields. So he assumed, oh, slavery's not going to spread because there really is no need for slavery to spread at this point. But that's going to become the major point, the big question that we're going to start asking. Is slavery going to spread as territories, of course, spread across the United States? Now, what we're looking at here, guys, is a chart, and what we're seeing here is, of course, the United States population growth from 1820 to 1860. Just to give you an idea of how much our population is going to increase in the United States in just a 40-year period. It really shows you, because if you look especially from 1840 to 1860, and of course, we're measuring this in millions, guys. So you can see that by the time we get from 1840 to 1860, we've had a population growth of nearly about 15 million people coming into the United States. And again, with the East Coast being heavily populated, too many people on the East Coast, people are going to start moving westward. All right, so just to kind of get us into the lesson, that's just some background information there. The big thing that we're going to talk about today, our big picture question as we start moving to the Civil War, is going to be, of course, how does the United States handle the possible expansion of slavery into the Western territories? But more importantly, how do we handle this without breaking apart the Union? And of course, we know, because we know that the Civil War is going to happen, this doesn't actually play out the way that they want it to. All right, so moving into the 1850s, this is a very, very heavy time in American history politically. A lot of political strife, a lot of back and forth fighting between the North and the South over, of course, the institution of slavery. Adding territories, do these territories and states become slave states, okay? By the time that we get to 1850, though, California is ready to become a state. If we remember, of course, from the gold rush of 1849, California's population is going to boom in just a year period. If you remember back from about, let's see, chapter 5, we were talking about, of course, the creation of the nation and how states, territories would become states. You got to remember, for a territory to become a state, you have to have 60,000 people living in that territory. Usually that takes a lot of territory, several years to get to that point to build that type of population. But by the time that we get to 1850, just a year after the gold rush, California has enough citizens in their state to apply for statehood. But when California comes together in 1850, they hold, of course, their state convention to write their state's constitution. The big thing in their state constitution that they did not want was slavery. So they wanted to enter the Union as a free state. So why is that such an issue in 1850s America? The big thing is it throws off the balance of power in Congress. We have seen since the early 1800s, we've started to see this building of friction between northern states and southern states over that balance of power in Congress. If you think back to the Missouri Compromise of 1820, that's why that compromise was written, to allow Maine to come in as a free state, Missouri to come in as a slave state, to keep that balance of power in Congress. You had 11 free states in Congress, 11 slave states in Congress. Keep that balance of power so no one side has too much. So really, again, it's really going to be about free states versus slave states at this point. And here's the thing, guys. The South is really worried about the institution of slavery at this point, and will this institution of slavery die off or be taken away from the Southern economy? Because you have to remember, without slavery, the Southern economy is going to tank, okay? So what's going to happen here, guys, is that we start to see this pushback. When the Compromise of 1850 is initially proposed by Henry Clay, who was the Speaker of the House, there's a lot of pushback from Southern states because, of course, they feel like if California, such a large state, is added to the Union as a free state, it throws off that balance of power. So Henry Clay, of course, the original architect of the Missouri Compromise of 1820, he's going to come back and, of course, be the architect of the Compromise of 1850. So he offers up a compromise. And what we want to do next is look at, of course, the provisions, the terms of this compromise. Again, we're talking about balance of power in Congress. We're trying to appease everybody as much as we possibly can, okay? So when it comes to the Compromise of 1850, let's look at some of the terms of the Compromise of 1850. Now, remember, the provisions are meant to appease the North and the South. You have to think about what that term compromise means. Does everybody get what they want when we have a compromise? Absolutely not. You don't get everything you want, but you try to find that middle ground that's going to work for everybody. Now, the first big provision of here, of course, is California is going to become a free state. The citizens of California wanted it to become a free state. It will be admitted into the Union as a free state. Next, what this is going to, of course, California being admitted as a free state, that appeases the North. One of the things that will appease the South is the implementation of a more effective fugitive slave law. In 1793, Congress, of course, came up with the Fugitive Slave Act. This was meant, of course, to bring slaves that had ran away back to the South to their slaveholders. But the problem with the Fugitive Slave Act that a lot of Southerners felt, it hadn't been very strict since it was implemented in 1793. So they want a stronger act. Southerners on plantations, massive plantations, they feel like, of course, their slaves are their property. They've paid a lot of money. That's a big investment into this. They, of course, want their workers back. Of course, that's a very negative way to think about it, but of course, that was the mentality and the mindset during that time period. So implementing more effective fugitive slave laws, so of course these slaveholders can get their property back, that's going to be a big thing to appease the South. Now, this next point appeases really both the North and the South, if you think about it, because what's going to happen here, guys, is how the decision is going to be made on how the new territories coming into the United States, how are they actually going to decide whether they want to be a free or a slave state? And Stephen Douglas, who is a senator from Illinois at this point, who's from the Chicago area, he's going to come up with the idea of introducing popular sovereignty. Of course, popular sovereignty is where you have control. And that means, of course, popular sovereignty, where the people are going to voice whether or not they want slavery in their territory. So in the rest of these territories that's going to be added to the United States, you're going to see that these territories are going to be allowed to choose whether or not they want to be slave or free states. That's going to cause even more issues that we're going to talk about here in just a moment. Now, also, too, Texas gets $10 million for Eastern New Mexico claim. Texas had a claim over Eastern New Mexico. And the issue there, guys, of course, this is a win for the North, is that Texas is not going to hold on to that extra territory. They're going to give it back, of course, to New Mexico. New Mexico is actually going to enter the Union as a free state. That's going to create less territory for slavery. Because at this point, Texas is a southern state, got a lot of land, got a lot of course, agriculture. Slavery is entrenched in Texas at this point. So that's going to mean less slavery in these territories. Another thing, too, of course, is going to be the banning of the slave trade in D.C. You have to think about this, of course, from the perspective of, a lot of Americans, especially in the North at this point. How does it look for foreigners to come to the United States and see that slaves are being sold in slave markets in our capital? For a lot of individuals, it doesn't put a good taste in people's mouth to know that this is, of course, the impression that people are getting of the United States when they come to our nation's capital. So a lot of abolitionists are going to push for the banning of the slave trade in D.C., but unfortunately, it doesn't end the provision of slavery in D.C. That will actually still exist in D.C. You can't sell slaves anymore in D.C., but you can, of course, have slaves in this territory. So again, all of these provisions are meant to, of course, appease both sides. At that point, it's going to take about 6 months, 6 to 8 months to actually get the compromise passed and through Congress and to appease everyone. And as a whole package, they're not going to be able to get this compromise passed. But what's going to happen, Stephen Douglas, who I've mentioned multiple times, the senator from Illinois, he's actually going to get the compromise passed by breaking it down into individual parts. So one part would go through Congress, they'd pass it, because here's the thing you have to think about. As a big package, it's not going to get passed through Congress. It's not meeting everybody's needs. It's not appeasing everyone as a whole, but individually it does appease a lot of the individuals, of course, in Congress at this point. Now, some of the problems with this compromise, a lot of people thought that once the compromise was signed, that everything was done, we were going to finally have some resolution to the slavery issue in the United States. But we're going to see a lot of protest violence and, of course, resistance following the passage of the Compromise of 1850. And one of the biggest things that we're going to see is the pushback, of course, from the Fugitive Slave Acts. You have to remember, by the time that we get to the early 1850s, the abolitionist movement, the movement to end slavery, is booming in the United States, especially in the North. We're starting to see a lot of pushback because slavery's become a moral issue. And what we're going to see, especially after the release of Uncle Tom's Cabin, This is a novel that actually is going to incite and actually enrage a lot of individuals in the United States over the issue of slavery because, of course, they see how bad the institution of slavery really is. A lot of Northerners were not aware of how bad it was. So we're starting to see that pushback because of the Fugitive Slave Act and, of course, the way that these individuals are treated being, of course, snatched up and taken back to plantations. But not only that, a lot of free individuals were being captured and taken back as a result of that. Now, another big thing before we finish this up, guys, with the Compromise of 1850 is it's going to cause even further divides because by the time that we get to 1854, there's a plan in place to actually run a railroad through new territory in the United States. But we had to kind of work out a plan to incorporate that territory and then, of course, make that territory and decide whether that territory is going to be free or slave territory. Now, Stephen Douglas is going to introduce this plan as a means of putting in a transcontinental railroad across the United States. And the big thing that it does is it repeals the Missouri Compromise. Guys, the Missouri Compromise, if you remember back from the 1820s, basically any territory south and west of the southern border of Missouri could become a slave state. But unfortunately, this gets rid of that provision, so anything west of Missouri at this point now can become a slave territory. And now they're going to allow popular sovereignty to decide in these territories, do we want these territories slave or free territories? By the time that we get to 1856, basically a mini civil war is going to break out. In Kansas and Nebraska, where this territory is being organized, you have pro and anti-slavery factions that are pushing back, of course, against either, slavery or no slavery in these states. So you've got people rushing in from all over to occupy this territory in violence, very horrible massacres, the Potawatomi Massacre, the sacking of Lawrence, on both sides, both of these sides violently attacking each other in order to decide, do we have slavery in this territory or not? All right, guys, so very quickly, we don't have a whole lot of time left, but I want to go ahead and jump to this chart here. So we've got a lot of discontent. We see, of course, discontent in Nebraska and in Kansas over the idea of choosing slavery. But again, we're starting to see our political parties fracture, new parties pop up as a result of these issues that are coming into play dealing with slavery in the late 1850s. So the biggest one that I want to talk about, because this is what's going to lead us into next week, is going to be the development of the Republican Party. We've got parties, the Free Soil Party that, of course, is pushing for anti-extension of slavery. They're pro-labor. The Know Nothing Party, this anti-immigration we talked about earlier, anti-Catholic. The Whig Party, pro-business. They're divided on slavery. But the big one that's going to be the big factor as we move into next week is going to be the Republican Party. And of course, many of you probably already know who's going to be one of the biggest leaders of the Republican Party as we move to the Civil War. You guessed it, it's Abraham Lincoln. And we're going to dig a little bit deeper into this next week. We don't have a whole lot of time left, but this is going to get us prepared to move into the Civil War next week. When we come back next week, guys, we're going to talk about, of course, the election of 1861. We're going to talk a little bit more about these political parties, the problem that these political parties are causing in the United States, and of course, how we're going to move into the Civil War and actually how the Civil War is going to start. I appreciate you guys having me today. I have enjoyed thoroughly being with you guys. I'm going to be here with you for the next 5 weeks after this. See you next week, guys.